This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme Sound. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate Chamber Programme signed.
So welcome members to the, first of all, we're open to the public. Welcome everybody. This is the 7th Committee for Finance meeting of the 22 to 27 mandate. As always, members, this will be broadcast online and in Parliament buildings. Those in the public gallery, which is no one at the minute, but you're not permitted to take photographs or record any of the minutes or any of the meeting. Members, we have received apologies from Dr. Aiken, Steve Aiken, who is at a bereavement. His father-in-law passed away. The clerk is arranging for a card to be sent on our behalf, on behalf of the committee. More practical than anything else, because I believe his father-in-law lived in the US. So our condolences, obviously, to Steve, his wife, and their family. We haven't received any other apologies, but Nicola Brogan is a tentative, so it may be that may be a tentative apology from Nicola. Agenda item 2 is declaration of interests. So members, obviously, as always, if there are any relevant interests, please declare them. Are there any interests to declare? If not, we'll go on to agenda item 3, which is Chairperson's business. Item 1 under Chairperson's business is the informal meeting which took place on Thursday the 14th of March, attended by myself and the clerk. There is a note of that meeting. It was a very detailed and useful meeting with the Construction Employers Federation. The notes at page 6, there are issues there that I think will inevitably come up during the course of our proceedings. Well, I mean, just for members' information, one of the things that comes out less a direct issue for the Finance Department, but certainly for the Infrastructure Department and elsewhere, is just the sheer scale of the problem that our kind of chaotic planning system is creating for the construction industry and therefore for capital projects in the public sector. But members, if you're happy to note, unless there's any comments. Yes, Jerry?
So on that, Chair, obviously I wasn't at the meeting, but I'd just be concerned seeing their recommendations calling for change the funding structures of NI Water, and I believe the CAF are for part privatisation, or is it sometimes called mutualisation of NI Water. So I'm just a bit concerned that sort of is being put on the agenda by them, and I would like to hope that obviously members wouldn't support that policy, but we can have some kind of committee reflection on people who have the alternative view of.
Well, obviously I wouldn't have. Yeah, I mean, I know
people have their own party policies, but just concerned that kind of position is being put by organisations, but including CF, and that we kind of reflect in our meetings the view of the widespread majority of, I think, parties and the public that water privatisation is a terrible idea.
Well, I share your concern around privatisation. Just to be clear, I wouldn't presume to give a view on behalf of the committee on that, and I'm not. That's not what those meetings are for. It was, I think, just to be clear, open to others. So it's always open to people to join those meetings, and the timing wasn't amazing. That is true. But just to reassure members, I would never, in that context, in the same way as I will occasionally be political in these meetings, and obviously I'm chair, but I will delineate where I'm being political, and others will, because we're all professional politicians. That's our job, to be political. That's totally fine, but I wouldn't presume to give a view on behalf of the committee on any matter of, or other members on any matter of substantive policy. But your views are totally legitimate and noted. Item 2, the budget bill. Members, the budget bill received royal assent on Thursday, the 14th of March. It is Chapter 1 of the Budget Act, Northern Ireland 2024. So that's the first piece of legislation that the new mandate has passed. Hopefully there's more, and slightly less routine. Item 3 is Westminster Bill, a piece of legislation which is passing through Westminster at the minute, which is the Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill. Members, this bill deals heavily with procurement and would apply in Northern Ireland. The background paper the background paper to the bill indicates that the LCM process has been activated regarding this jurisdiction. These correspond to clauses of the bill which deal with procurement. The clerk has tried to ascertain if the committee should expect legislative consent motions, as in if this committee there will be a legislative consent motion, but it would be, I think, is it still slightly to be determined which committee will deal with it?
Chair, I think there's likely to be potentially 2 for this committee. There may also be 1 for economy.
Yeah.
But we're trying to ascertain what has happened with the process. So on the schedule, it indicates that a legislative consent motion process has been initiated, but the department hasn't clarified yet whether they're working on this. So if we could correspond, especially that would be helpful. That's
important. I mean, as you said, now, just to be clear, I am saying something political, not as an impartial chair. This bill is otherwise known as the anti-BDS bill. It is designed to do something which I think is problematic, and not just problematic because of the seriousness of what's happening in Israel and Gaza at the minute, but because of the potential other consequences that could happen down the line in relation to other international issues. I think it's a very deeply objectionable bill, speaking on behalf of myself and my party, but in any case it is highly controversial and people will have strong views on it. So if members are agreed on this, that we will write to the department to seek confirmation, so that we have a process in place, so we know if the department has been engaged with on this, I think would be helpful in the first instance, and I'm happy if anybody else wants to speak to this issue.
What agenda item are we on?
Sorry, we're agenda item 3, Deirdre, which is Chairperson's business, and we're talking about the final bit of that, which is this Economic Activity of Public Bodies Bill, which is basically what's called the anti-BDS bill, which is very controversial and certainly from my perspective very problematic and objectionable, but others will have views on it. There will be an LCM, legislative consent motion, so the action we're proposing for now, I mean, I put on the record my own view about it, but I think the process for us is to start is to write to the department first of all to see if they have had any communication. This is a UK government bill, it's not something any local department has responsibility for, but there will be an LCM here. If anybody else wants to talk to that.
Chair, it might just be worth pointing out that it doesn't necessarily mean we will get anything. The executive will have to come to a view as to whether or not it is collectively supportive of legislative consent motion being brought forward.
Yeah.
So that might be where things are at the minute. There's an executive discussion, but it would just be useful for us in terms of timescales to pin that down, so that we just have an idea in terms of work planning.
Yes, I mean, this is, I think, at the House of Lords, at the committee stage in the House of Lords at the minute, and I think there are amendments which would exclude the devolved administrations from the scope of this bill. I hope, speaking personally again, that those amendments pass. I think this is a deeply problematic bill, but if people are content, we'll write to the department to find out where it's at and really what the department have heard in terms of where the process is.
Yeah, no, I think that's the right thing to do, Chair. Obviously, we can sit here and debate the merits and demerits of the bill and people's particular views, but this may not make its way to this committee. So I'm happy that we write to that, and should it come to this committee, then we can have the discussion then.
Sure we will. Okay. People are content. We'll move on to agenda item 4, which is draft minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of March, which is page 11. If members are content that these minutes are a true reflection of the proceedings, and if people are, then I will sign the minutes.
Agreed.
Okay. Agenda item 5 is matters arising. Item 1 under matters arising is public finance scrutiny points. Members at page 20 of scrutiny, page 20 of your pack, there are scrutiny points drawn from raised budget and public finance training modules 1 and 2 delivered to the committee previously, and obviously we just had one a second ago. If members are agreed, we will forward these to the department for a response. Item 2 is a response from the department, which is on the issue which was raised, I believe, last week after our meeting with Stuart, the Officer of Accounts, on the interest received from the Northern Ireland Consolidated Fund, aka the devolved bank account. For those who want it, on page 21, as I said, of the meeting pack, the fund earned on temporary investments of 100,000 for the year, which compared to 3,000 for the previous 12 months, and reflects the increased base rate over the period. So that is quite a substantial increase in the amount of interest earned. I would like to have that bank account myself, where your interest rises from £3,000 one year to £100,000 the next. But they will. If members are content, I'm not sure if there's anything arising. I mean, the upshot is that if interest is earned, it reduces what's called the cash requirement from the UK government. So it's not like there's £100,000 for us to lobby to be spent in our constituencies. Sadly, it comes off the cash requirement from the UK Consolidated Fund. So if members are content, we will, or if there's any further information people want to ask for, we will. Yes.
To say, I think that it's important for us as a committee to, ask for these numbers and keep an eye on them, because, as you say, it is quite a substantial increase on interest made on the money that's passing through Northern Ireland. So it's good to have it.
I think it is, and I think I would also say, Diane, one point about it's sometimes understanding how these concepts work. I think it is important for us, because there are bits. So the external, we sometimes think this place is closed off into itself, but the external world does impact on, including interest rates. For example, we've just got increased borrowing power under this new deal, but the rate at which we borrow is determined by interest rates generally in the world. And there was a period when interest rates were very low. They went up very high. So it is important that we pay attention to these things. Item 3 is the Interparliamentary Forum and Scrutiny of Common Frameworks. Members at page 22 of the briefing pack, there is a letter from the Chair of the Lords Constitution Committee, which it goes to the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities regarding scrutiny of common frameworks. Excuse me. This was following on from the Interparliamentary Forum, which I attended on behalf of the committee at the end of last month, and this essentially sets out the discussion that happened on common frameworks and is copied to First and Deputy First Ministers and the First Minister and the relevant ministers in Scotland and Wales. So if people are content to note that or would like any more information, that's fine.
Chair, if it's useful, we have one common framework for finance. There are, I'm going to say, 31 that the Assembly interacts with. We have one. So agriculture, the ERA and economy have more.
A common framework is basically an agreed set of rules about how a particular bit of the regulation or works post-Brexit, particularly in the area of things like services and professional qualifications, and lots of other areas. But and lots to be debated. We could have a very long argument, a Brexit-related argument, but even I won't go there at this point. Item 5 is follow-up information from Land and Property Services. At the first day briefing that we had from LPS on the 20th of February, members requested a number of bits of information, which included cost to LPS when domestic customers pay, rates by credit card, the data handling rule for Fujitsu if they are awarded the land registration contract. People will remember there was a bit of an issue with that tendering process and some of the legalities around it that we went into. There was also data asked on the recipients that Mr. Carroll asked for on industrial D-rating recipients, and also plans to increase revenue generation, which I think was something that I asked at. So these are at at pages 3 to 5 of people's tabled pack. People can look at that information at their leisure, unless anybody wants to raise any of it at the minute. Okay, in that case, we'll then move on to item 6, which is follow-up information on the Orchard House refurbishment. We had an update on the refurbishment of Orchard House at a recent hearing with the department, and there is an update on that on page 5 of the table pack for those who are interested. Item 7 is follow-up information on the WMS on the regional rate. At the meeting on the 6th of March, I reiterated that should written ministerial statements refer to percentages, that a figure should be inserted to that effect, and there should be clarity on what inflation measures have been used. The department has provided comments and indicated that it has been noted by the department in the context of future statements regarding requiring that additional clarity. I hope it's been noted and will be acted upon, say, with a degree of prickliness. Okay. Now, at agenda item 6 is SR 2023-45, the Public Service Pensions Revaluation Order 2024. Members, at the meeting on the 6th of March, we agreed that we were content with a proposed statutory rule to specify the annual percentage change in the general level of prices or earnings used by career average revalued earnings public service pension schemes for the purpose of revaluing active members' pension benefits. The rule has now been laid and is subject to negative resolution. It will come into effect on 1st of April 2024. Full details can be found starting at page 25 of the meeting pack. In her 4th report, which can be found on page 35 of the meeting pack, the Examiner of Statutory Rules has not drawn any matters to this committee's attention. Are members content with the statutory rule? If so, then I'll put the question that the Committee for Finance has considered SR 45/2024, the Public Service Pensions Revaluation Order Northern Ireland 2024, and has no objection to the rule.
Agreed.
Agreed, okay. At agenda item 7, SL1, the Pensions Increase Review Order Northern Ireland 2024. Members, the Department of Finance is proposing to make a statutory rule which will make provision for the annual increase of official pensions. Full details can be found in the briefing note and correspondence from the Department at page 44 of the meeting pack. This proposed statutory rule is not subject to any Assembly procedure. Members, if they are content to note the proposed statutory rule to make provision for the annual increase of official pensions, or does anybody want to make any comments or ask any questions? In that case, we'll move on to agenda item 8, SL1, the Coronavirus Act 2020, Registration of Deaths and Stillbirths, Extension number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2024, and SR 2024-57, the Coronavirus Act 2020, Registration of Deaths and Stillbirths, Extension number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2024. Members, the Department of Finance is proposing to make a statutory rule which will extend the expiry date of the temporary provisions in the Coronavirus Act 2020 in relation to death and stillbirth registration. The rule is subject to confirmatory resolution and will extend the provisions until 24th September 2024, time which GRO intend to use to advance separate legislation to make these provisions permanent, as we have discussed at this committee a couple of times now. Members, SL1 and SL2 have both, SL1 and the SR have both arrived in time for the meeting of the committee. Members were aware, as we've discussed in the past, that further extension to the provisions would be made prior to a new legislative vehicle being brought forward, and we have also noted the importance of having a separate legislative vehicle for it. Full details in the SL1 can be found in the briefing note and correspondence from the Department at page 50 of the meeting pack. And full details of the SR can be found in SL5 at page 13 of the tabled pack. Members, content with the statutory rule, would anybody like to make any remarks?
Yeah, just remarks, Chair, if I may. It's important that we as a committee hold the GRO to account on this with regards to apply pressure to make sure that he does bring forward the regulations in good, timely fashion. It shouldn't be that difficult to do in a speedy manner. Whenever we have seen the output of the regulation, what it does, positive nature of it, and then the fact that it's only regulations as opposed to primary. So it shouldn't take long in order to produce that for us, and we should be in a position where we can safely say that an extension to this Coronavirus Act should not be required again, and in light of that, I'm content.
Okay. Well, I would expect, and I think we already confirmed with them, that they would keep us posted on the production or the preparation of this legislation whenever the GRO is in front of us. So, if members are content, I will put the question that the Committee for Finances considered SR 2024-57, the Coronavirus Act 2020, Registration of Death and Stillbirths Extension Number 2, Order Northern Ireland 2024, and has no objection to the rules subject to the report of the Examiner of Statutory Rules. Okay.
Thank you.
Agenda item 15 is the rates exemption for automatic telling machines in rural areas, regulations 2024. People might have noticed a pattern. We are now getting updated versions of some of the regulations that we approved retrospectively in our first meeting, which one of the rural ATM exemption is one of them. Members, the Department of Finance is proposing to make a statutory rule which will reinstate a micro policy within the rating system. It's a very unkind term for calling something a micro policy, isn't it? A micro policy within the rating system, which applies a rates exemption to automatic telling machines in designated rural areas. At the committee meeting on 6th of March, members agreed to seek clarification from the Department of Finance on recipients most likely to benefit from this rates exemption. The information has been provided at page 336. It's a very large table pack today, 336 of the tabled pack. Are members content to, if members, sorry, 331, my apologies. No, 336 is the information. For ease of reference, full detail of the proposed rule that we're asking you to approve can be found in the briefing note and correspondence at page 331. Financial implications, people will note, is less than £50,000. This is now a very small number of ATMs. I'll just talk through the briefing, and then I'll go to for comments. So this was previously considered on the 6th of March. The proposed statutory rule is subject to affirmative resolution. So before I ask if members are content with the proposed statutory rule, I will open it up for comments. Paul Frew, if anybody
just to say, who knows what untold and unspeakable damage could be done under the guise of a micro policy, but it seems to be the case that this one's fine. Okay,
I'm glad you put that on the record. Jerry Carroll.
Yeah, I mean, I know, Chair, it's been said before by yourself and others that 50,000 isn't millions or billions, and it isn't, but I just note with concern that page 336 states that the majority of recipients for this relief are banks or electronic money service companies. I mean, banks aren't struggling. The last time I checked, their profits are up. So I have just a bit of concern that people have been asked to pay more rates. Yeah. Banks are getting an exemption. The point can be made about a small exemption, but still, principle is important. So I have some uneasy concerns about that.
I think you make a fair point about the fact that banks, I mean, Bank of Ireland had a 90% increase in its profits this year. They have basically had a completely grotesque and outrageous profits over the last while. It is important to say, though, it's not just banks, it's some of these electronic money services companies who are increasingly the providers, as you will just know from yourself from looking around. The fewer and fewer banks bother to actually manage these. You can see that in Belfast. It's not something that banks particularly invest in themselves anymore. It is a relatively small sum of money, and I'm not actually even sure that the Department of Finance would have the vi-res legally to make them, because they don't own. There's very limited legislative power in a devolved sense on financial services, so they probably wouldn't have the power to legislate, to mandate, to provide them to do it. But I think your point is made. So this is obviously a small micro policy, but your point is made around banks.
Worth taking into the micro now.
Well, indeed, yeah, and there are. I mean, I think there are broader conversations about banks and their responsibilities, and there is a bit of a policy gap. I think I've certainly in the previous mandate, there are banks in Northern Ireland that are, some of whom are still part owned by the British taxpayer, others are part owned by the Irish taxpayer, and they are, and they're not necessarily living up to their responsibilities here, and we haven't always got the political tools to put pressure on them. Deirdre Hark, you want to?
Yeah, no, I take the point. I mean, in terms of where financial power is and even how it's extracted out of our local economy as well. And obviously, I know in the last mandate there was a draft report done on community wealth building and looking at financial power. And I think there can be work done then. That sits within DFC at the minute, but how that dovetails into the finance department and then also the economy brief as well. But I think in the short term, I mean, this is a necessity in terms of the communities that are impacted in rural areas. We've seen this morning again more news of bank closures. So there's definitely more work to be done. I mean, you're right, some of these are reserved matters, and it's what pressure we can bring to bear on banking and financial services institutions, and what we can do then in the medium to longer term in terms of looking at democratising that financial power. But I think in the short term, we need to be doing this in terms of the impact it has on those communities that rely on this existing service, albeit it's limited. But
Diane.
Yeah, and Chair, just to say the importance of this shouldn't be underestimated, because there is an expectation of a lot of service providers that they don't need to put ATMs into facilities. In my own constituency, we've got the first banking hub in Northern Ireland, and they don't have an ATM, which is something that a request has been put in after the event for, where most people thought after all the closures of the banks and the closures of the ATMs, they would have an ATM in the banking hub. So it's not an automatic thing that banks, banking hubs or any facilities put in. So I feel like this exemption is obviously needed to encourage that, to ensure that cash facility is there.
And particularly people who are like rural and elderly and financially excluded, they're, with the best will in the world, they're not all going to move on to kind of contactless and get change their bank accounts. So it is important. Okay. If members are content to note that proposed statutory rule to make provision for reinstating a micropolicy applying a rates exemption to ATMs in designated rural areas, I think we've now made comments. We are content to note. Agenda item 16 is SL1, Rates Temporary Rebate Amendment Order Northern Ireland 2024. Members, the Department is proposing to make a statutory rule which will reinstate the Back in Business scheme. At the committee meeting on the 6th of March, we agreed to seek clarification from the Department on a number of issues related to this proposed statutory rule, including confirmation that it was not possible to benefit from the Back in Business scheme while being a beneficiary of other rates relief. Information on recipients most likely to benefit from the scheme and any data to support this information. Members also agreed to ask if officials had examined any potential adjustments to the scheme in the context of recent consultations on additional revenue raising. So this information, those various bits of information are provided at page 343 in a helpfully concise page from Andrew McAvoy. The adjustments to the scheme have not been considered in the consultation, and it does prevent the double relief, if you like, or multiple reliefs, and the other information is provided there. Full details of the rule that can be found, that we're being asked to consider, can be found in the briefing pack and note and correspondence from the department at page 338 of the tabled pack. This was considered previously on the 6th of March. This proposed statutory rule is subject to affirmative resolution procedure. Members, if you are content to note the proposed statutory rule to make provision for the increase of official pensions, or if the rates temporary, there's a slight typo there, the rates if you are content to note the proposed statutory rule, or if you wish to make any comments. No?
Agreed.
Okay, agreed. Agenda item 9, monthly outturn. Members, I draw your attention to page 58 of the meeting pack, which provides the committee with a full analysis of 23-24 outturn and forecast for round 11, forecast outturn for, ready for the Easter break here, outturn and forecast outturn for round 11th of February. The department has committed to provide this analysis each month as part of its ongoing engagement with the committee on 23-24 in-year spend in order to facilitate the committee's scrutiny of the public expenditure position. Members, have you any comment to make?
Chair, Deputy Chair.
Oh, sorry, Deputy Chair.
Yeah, and I welcome these reports, but as I go through them, its tables and its numbers, as a committee, should we maybe request that the department highlight and star things with significant variances in terms of percentages or amounts? Because again, you're just scrolling through tables and tables of numbers, trying to ask questions based on what you're looking at, and actually some of the things with significant variations might have a very simple and valid reason for it. So I don't know if it's something that could be added in our reports that come here.
Yes, I think that is a completely reasonable thing to do, and it might be. I mean, it shouldn't take that. As you say, it's just it's just raw tables. Now, obviously, some of us are, including yourself, are more qualified to interrogate tables than others, but that doesn't mean that it's not unreasonable for them to ask us to give us.
Chair, we'll have officials in on the full end of year outturn plus round 13, which is the ALBs, on the 17th of April. I'm going to say that. Stephen's nodding at me, so that's true. And that'll be an opportunity to get into that detail of, we'll flag it up in the meantime, but they can give more sort of live feedback on what more they can do.
Okay. Now, so that's a useful follow-up. We will write to them on that regard. Agenda. The next item is spring supplementary estimates. The oral briefing from the department from Joanne McBurney, who is a regular visitor already, and Barry Armstrong. So if members are content, we'll get agreement that Hansard should record and report this oral briefing. If we're content, members, draw your attention to Clark's memo and departmental briefing papers at page 90 of the meeting pack. There was a typographical error in the spring supplementary estimates which issued in the main meeting pack, probably right in the middle of the tables and page. So if anyone spotted it, then
was at the start.
Right, okay. So spotter's badge to anybody who spotted it. At page 12 of the table pack, the updated SSEs are there. Members, there is going to be a plenary debate on the SSEs on Tuesday, the 9th of April. So we have plenty of time to prepare for them. Officials are attending today to give us a further briefing. So we have Joanne McBurney, who has obviously been here a few times already, for Head of the Public Spending Directorate, and Barry Armstrong, who is Head of Supply Division and has also been with us a couple of times already. If we could ask Joanne and or Barry to make a brief opening statement, and then we'll have some questions. Thank you.
Will let Barry do that?
I hope it wasn't quite as brief as the read-through gave, and we just head on the budget bill, but if you want to stop me, feel free. Sorry. So, as the Finance Minister explained when introducing the budget bill, the timing of the Executive's restoration meant that the budget bill and the spring supplementary estimates could not be prepared until a very late point in the financial year, and this meant there was an urgent need to secure royal assent on the budget bill in order to ensure that departments and other bodies could continue to access cash that they required from the Northern Ireland Consolidated Fund to deliver services for the remainder of the financial year. In normal circumstances, the estimates would be brought to the Assembly for its approval by way of the supply resolution immediately prior to the introduction of the budget bill. However, because of the exceptional timing this year, the time delay that would have resulted from waiting for the work required to prepare the detailed financial information contained in the SSE document before introducing the budget bill would have risked departments reaching the limits set by the previous Northern Ireland Budget No. 2 Act 2023 before the new budget bill could have passed and received royal assent. You'll be aware from the Finance Minister's written ministerial statement on the 29th of February that it was necessary to actually use contingency powers in the Financial Provisions Northern Ireland Order 1998 to make an advance from the Consolidated Fund in order to provide cash to the DOF pension scheme. And had the Budget Act not received royal assent, which it actually did on the 14th of March past, two other departments, Department of Communities and Department of Finance, would have reached their cash limits actually today.
Is that your way of saying I told you so?
It was just timed perfectly.
There you go. So what would have practically happened then, just out of interest? Would pensioners not have got their money?
As I mentioned, what we had to do with the DOF pension scheme, which is actually the Northern Ireland Civil Service pension scheme, is there is a contingency power in the 1998 Financial Provisions Order, which is there as an emergency safety net, but it is strictly limited in the amount that can be issued. So up to a certain amount, we could have fallen back on that power, but once we reached the limit of that, then actually we would have been against a wall, frankly.
Okay.
But now that the spring supplementary estimates have been completed, the Finance Minister intends to bring this to the Assembly for its agreement, together with the 2024-25 vote on account, with the debate on the supply resolutions timetabled following the Easter recess on Tuesday the 9th of April. So just to explain the purpose of the estimates set out the detailed spending plans which were legislated for in the budget bill, including the resources, the capital and the cash required. There are two types of estimates: the main estimate, based on the opening budget at the start of the financial year, and these spring supplementary estimates at the end of the financial year, following any in-year adjustments to the budgets. Once agreed by the Assembly, the SSEs will form what's called the Statement of Assembly Supply, against which departments and other bodies' accounting officers will account, and the 2023-24 accounts will be prepared. Just want to mention as well the review of financial process. Following the passage of the Financial Reporting Departments and Public Bodies Act, Northern Ireland 2022, the review of financial process has been implemented, and with a number of changes to how financial information is presented in the estimates and the associated budget bill compared to previously. The most significant of these are clearer alignment of financial information between budgets, estimates and accounts. Expenditure of arm's length bodies, commonly referred to as NDPBs, which would have always been included in the budgets, is now also consolidated in the estimates and accounts so that they're aligned, and that the financial information can be directly compared. Capital expenditure is now voted directly. Separate control totals are voted in the budget bill for departmental expenditure limits, generally referred to as DALE, and also separate control totals for annually managed expenditure, both current and capital, and separate control totals for non-budget expenditure, again both current and capital. Cash requirements continue to be voted, and rather than the Department of Finance laying a minute following the passage of the budget bill to authorise the use of accruing resources, generally referred to as receipts, the Assembly now actually authorises the use of income directly in the budget bill itself. The Department is very keen to take the views from the Committee on the usefulness of the new format of the estimates, as well as the corresponding budget bill. In normal circumstances, the Executive would have agreed a series of monitoring rounds over the course of the 23-24 financial year, resulting in a final plan position being agreed in early January, to which these estimates would normally have been written. Because of the uncertainty over the total quantum of funding available and the need to wait for the Chief Secretary to confirm the detail of the financial package which accompanied the restoration of the Executive, it meant that it was only possible for the Executive to make a decision on the 15th of February on allocations to departments to address overspends and to provide funding for public sector pay awards. Given the time...
Just to be clear, just explain for the purpose, for the benefit of the committee, how the decisions of the Executive impacted what was in the spring supplementary estimates.
Yes, well that's what I'm just about to go on to here. So given the time required and then prepare the financial details to be included in the budget bill and for it to be ready to be introduced in the Assembly. To have delayed the preparation of the budget bill until after this decision wasn't viable due to the risk of departments reaching their cash limits before the bill could be passed and royal assent secured. So with the Executive's agreement, the Finance Minister decided to prepare the budget bill and these corresponding spring supplementary estimates to include headroom to ensure that departments will have the authority to spend the budget which would then be subsequently allocated to them by the Executive. So these SSEs were therefore written to a position which includes headroom based on departments' forecast expenditure and departments' estimated cost for potential public sector pay awards. Now, since then, the Finance Minister announced the outcome of the Executive's decision on in-year allocations in a written ministerial statement on the 15th of February. All ministers have committed to constrain their department's expenditure, including pay awards, to the budget allocation agreed by the Executive and not by that higher amount of headroom included in the SSEs if it is higher. And Table 5 in the SSE document sets out the provision that's included in the SSEs and Budget Act beyond the outcome of the Executive's 23-24.
Table 5 in the main supplementary estimates doc.
That's correct, yes. It's on page 19. Okay. This is a highly unusual situation which was driven by the timing of events, and the Finance Minister has been clear that she does not anticipate that this will be a situation that we will face again. And the Executive now has the opportunity to agree its 24-25 budget and for ministers to set their expenditure plans accordingly.
Okay.
I just want to also just highlight the use of sole authority for the Budget Act, simply because information about it appears in the SSE document as well. So as the Finance Minister explained during the debate on the Budget Bill, there are a number of functions which departments are delivering under sole authority of the Budget Act Northern Ireland 2024. This includes some functions for which expenditure is greater than the Assembly would normally have been asked to approve. This is a result of the absence of an executive and functioning Assembly, which has prevented the Assembly legislating for these functions in the normal way. And details of these functions are set out in Table 6 of the SSE document, and it was also provided to the Committee in advance of the introduction of the Budget Bill. As well as the spring supplementary estimates, a vote on account for 24-25 is also being laid in the Assembly for its approval. This corresponds to the 24-25 authorisations that were in the Budget Act Northern Ireland 2024. As the Finance Minister explained in the Assembly during the debate, while the normal level of the vote on account would be set at 45% of the previous year's provision, the vote on account for the 24-25 year is being set at approximately 65%. This was done to recognise that the timing of the Executive's restoration and the time necessary for the ministers to determine spending priorities within the funding envelope set by the budget means it's possible that the Assembly may not have been able to complete its consideration of the Budget No. 2 Bill before the summer recess. So, to conclude then, we're happy to address any questions the Committee may have in order to assist its consideration of the SSEs and the vote on account.
Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, members should indicate should you wish to ask a question, and the clerk will take a note. Thank you, Barry and Joanne. Just a couple of questions from me. First of all, you mentioned what the table 5 on page 19, provision beyond the outcome of the 23-24 final plan. That was what you described as an unusual table. Does that table is there normally a table like that in spring supplementary estimates?
There hasn't been in the past, but it is something that if there was ever a need to include headroom in an estimate, it would be something that we would be intending to do again for transparency. Yeah. Because what we want the Assembly to be able to do is to be able to directly see from any budget announcements and any budget figures that are presented, to be able to read those directly across into an estimates document. So in a situation where that would happen again, then we would certainly intend to include a table like this.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, this was the difference. The Table 5 represents, the numbers of Table 5 are non-ring fenced DEL, one tiny amount of ring fenced DEL and a bit of capital DEL for communities. They represent the difference between the delta, I suppose, between what departments said they thought they would need prior to 15th of February and what was actually agreed as their allocation on the 15th of February, so they can't spend this money? Is that no?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. So this is not that's not money that's just sitting there for them to spend. That's money that was in. That's money that has been legally authorised, but it's not going to be spent by them.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, that's useful. What are there any particular reasons for the variance? So infrastructure is quite high. It's 30 million higher.
Well, there were decisions that were required to be made by the executive that we couldn't have preempted in terms of exactly how much money the executive would decide to allocate to particular departments. So there were decisions there to be made. So what we for every department there, we had to include what we could assess to be that this is the most that the executive could allocate to that.
Okay.
That department.
Could you just sort of set out for us in headline terms then, what are the biggest changes in the SSEs versus the main estimates? Where have the biggest movements been?
Well, the biggest movements would be around pay and the allocation for overspends, because the main estimates were based on the Secretary of State's budget announced at the start of the year. So the main changes would be around those allocations that the Executive agreed on the 15th. As Barry says, we have built in headroom for those. The bit that's in the headroom table is the bit that wasn't allocated, but the bits that were in the WMS on the 15th of February would be the biggest quantum of the changes. There also would have been some transfers between Whitehall departments and Northern Ireland departments, which would normally happen during the year, so they would be reflected in that as well. And there may have been some transfers between departments as well.
What about there seems to be quite a big fall in resource from main to supplementary in resource spending for the Department of Economy. Is that, I don't know if there's a particular reason for that. If I'm looking at the right number, nearly 200 million.
Sorry, that was changes in the student loan provision,
okay,
which is generally managed in annually managed expenditure. So it's a ring fenced purpose.
So that's AME rather than DAL.
Yes.
Yeah, though there may have been changes in their student loan impairment in DAL. Again,
yes.
Looking at the detail, it could have been either of those.
Yeah.
But
okay, so that would explain that.
Yeah, certainly. And any of those significant changes with Department for Economy, I know the biggest proportion of that would be linked to student loans.
Okay, that's helpful. Just on the 65, on the 65%, you touched on that in your opening remarks, Barry, and how obviously that we were asked to do as it were, a larger vote on account. Explain again how that interacts with so what, just for people's understanding, we're doing another vote on account to 65%. But with a little bit more information than we had before when we did a previous vote for 65%. Yes, is that right?
It is correct. And because in the normal circumstances, this would have come before the budget bill, and the intention with doing having this vote on account is really to inform the decision on the budget bill. And I fully appreciate this is not the normal sequence of events. But the purpose behind the 65% is if it hasn't been possible for the budget bill to have completed its passage through the Assembly before the summer recess, and hence then royal assent won't be secured until the early autumn. This is to ensure that departments will have the ability to continue to spend money on delivering services. I would stress again, as I stressed when I was here giving evidence on the budget bill, this is not a substitute for setting a budget. It is purely a mathematical formula that is applied to the cash and resource and capital requirements of the departments to ensure that they can continue to operate until the budget has been set and approved. Okay,
and how would you anticipate the main estimates being affected by, so this to be the main estimates for 24-25 in, I guess, June? Our current expectation is that we won't, unless the Finance Minister lays the budget in the next few days, because we're due to be in recess from next week, and then we'll have, by the time we come back, it'll be the end of the financial year, so that bit of the Northern Ireland Act is going to be breached. The requirement to have a budget statement by the end of the financial year is not going to happen. But should we have a budget statement? I think the Minister said in April or May, I can't remember now, I don't want to misquote her. I think she said mid-April. That'll be a budget statement. How will that affect what's in the main estimates document, and what will you be I'll let you talk.
Sorry. Well, the main estimates document will be written to the position then that the Minister will announce following the Executive's decision on its budget, which we hope to be in April. What the main estimates will then also show is, with each department having received its overall budget envelope, that will then allow each individual minister to make his or her decisions as to how they're going to use that and how they're going to allocate that across all the spending areas, all the arm's length bodies and all the services their departments deliver. So when the ministers have made those decisions, that financial information then will all be captured in the main estimates document and set out in this similar format to this spring supplementary estimate to correspond to all the spending areas in each department.
Can I ask you, Joanne, now, is the budget document ready? Is it in draft?
We can't prepare a budget document until the Executive has taken decisions on its budget allocations, but work is ongoing in that, and the Finance Minister is intending to bring a paper to the Executive after Easter.
After Easter?
Yeah.
Okay, look forward to that. That's good to know. So after Easter we'll get a budget document. One final question for me, in terms of, I don't have the information to read across the sole authority. I feel like if Jim Allister were here, I'd try not to channel Jim Allister, but if he were here, I'd be asking about the black box and the sole authority of the budget. What is the number relative to last year? Is it going up or down? There was a very big number in the last year or two. So hopefully it's gone down from that.
I don't have last year's figure to hand. Apologies. I know the figure this year is 23,820,000.
So most of that, a good chunk of that's welfare mitigations?
Yeah, so there's 11 million is welfare mitigations. It's by far and away the biggest piece. I've spoken to colleagues in Department for Communities, and the intention is that there will be advice going to the Communities Minister in terms of how to put that on a proper statutory footing later this year. I think in the summer. The other three areas where the provision under sole authority of the Budget Act is higher than would normally be the case are in TEO, and that's ending violence against women and girls, Truth Recovery Programme and Homes for Ukraine. The Truth Recovery Programme and Homes for Ukraine, the intention is for that to be legislated for in a financial provisions bill, which the Department of Finance intends to be bringing to the Assembly this year. Ending violence against women and girls, I think they had looked at that in the financial provisions bill, but actually advice from the legal advisors was that actually it warrants a standalone piece of legislation itself. So again, TEO will be better placed to give details on exactly what their intentions are there, but I know that is being pursued now.
Okay. Diane Forsyth.
Yep, thanks Chair, and thanks to both of you for being back again here today. I just wanted to ask, so are the current and revised positions in the SSA memoranda substantially due to the restoration package settlement?
Yes.
And in terms of applying the effective write-offs to the different departments, was that applied just evenly across the board, or was there assessments of each individual department and financial governance before applying the effective write-off?
Departments provided forecasts of their financial position throughout the year. The funding that was provided on the 15th of February was based on their forecasts of their overspend. Given the time in the year where ministers returned, it was too late for ministers to make other decisions, so really too late to change that spending trajectory, so it was based on their forecasts. Okay, thank you. And would the department have a view on all of the different departments' positions on their budget, and do they follow a consistent approach, or would there be different approaches from different departments? I would say the circumstances of each department is different. Departments have different arm's length bodies, different mechanisms for funding, so every department is very slightly different and will take a different approach. In saying that, the supply teams, of which Barry's head of one set of them, work very closely with departments to get a good understanding of what's happened throughout the year and to challenge them. And now we're in a normal process with ministers in post. There will be ongoing challenge, and the allocations in budgets and monitoring rounds will be based on that engagement between departments and that challenge role that supply carry out.
I think the only thing I would add to that is I don't think there is such a thing as an average or a typical department. Every department faces its own challenges, and that's part of our job is to make sure that the team that work for me have that detailed and regular interaction with departments, so that as issues emerge, they're aware of them and can help to assist to address them. If that's probably as well as I can answer your question.
Yeah,
All right.
no, and it just highlights the importance of your role so centrally there. It's just important to pick up on the good examples from the departments who are doing things really well and pass across the good practice. And just one other question from me. I noted the 17 public employer liability cases pending. Does the department know when they'd be likely to put a figure in those?
Okay, sorry, can I ask which department is that? Sorry.
I think that was into the Department of Finance.
Department of Finance.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. That's really a question I would need to defer to DOF's own finance team to answer that, because although we are within the Department of Finance, we sort of sit outside the department's own finance team. So I can certainly take that question to them to provide you with an answer, but I don't have that detail. And
well, that's grand. Just in case, I was just wondering if some of them are quite substantial or not, to see how they would affect the wider budgeting process. But no, thanks very much.
Okay. Deirdre Hargey?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's just to see if you're confident that the main estimates in the budget bill too will be presented before the summer recess.
Presented, yes.
Yeah.
Now, subject obviously to the executive having agreed that budget, but yes.
And just in terms of then the quantum of money that the executive is likely to carry over into 24-25 under the budget exchange scheme.
There's no carry forward for resource Dell, because the additional funding that came in the financial package came from a reserve claim, and statement of funding policy says you cannot carry that forward. We will have the normal limits on all other expenditure categories, so we will be able to carry forward some capital Dell, some financial transactions capital, etc. That's based on a percentage of the final plan. Don't have the figure off the top of my head. I think capital it's maybe about 30 million or so if there are underspends at that level, but the focus has to be obviously on maximising our use of resource Dell funding at this stage.
And I suppose just lastly, the review of the financial process, just how it has improved the budgeting process, and if there's any more changes that are likely to be made, and do you know where?
We're not anticipating to make any changes this year unless, for example, in comments from yourselves, you feel there is something else that can be done. It was unfortunate that when the review financial process was actually implemented, it was at a point when the Assembly wasn't functioning. What I would hope that in this coming year, the 24-25 year, that it will actually demonstrate the improvement, because we'll be able to follow that for the cycle of having the budget set, the Assembly seeing what the Executive's budget has been set, and then be able to immediately read that across whenever it's voting on the estimates in the budget bill, and actually be able to clearly see what it is voting. So I'm hoping that this year will demonstrate the benefit of it, and also maybe identify if there are any further improvements to be made. But I don't think now is the time to change it before having done that.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay. Jerry Carroll?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Brian, Joanne. I have some questions you'll probably be able to answer, and quite a lot that you may not be able to answer, so I'll ask some of them, and maybe through the Chair I can email them through, because they have quite a lot of detail. But in terms of who you might, I mean, obviously the budget cover transfers, as I understand it, may be used as mechanisms to sort of protect public services. Has Westminster indicated to yourselves or ministers whether there's a hard limit on that? And the second easy question, hopefully, but more a comment, I suppose, it's obviously you referred to it, Barry, in the opening, is that the ministers have committed to constraining the department's expenditure, including pay awards. I mean, that's very, very concerning in any level, but especially given that there was a lot of emphasis made about public sector pay awards in this new administration. So I'm presuming that ministers haven't factored in the likes of Department for Economy, the possibility of further education workers, rejecting pay offers. So, as far as you know, has that been factored into the department's estimates?
Sorry.
Do you want to go on?
Well, in terms of any of the pay awards, the executive made a decision on. Now, they didn't allocate specific amounts for specific pay awards. There was an overall amount allocated to each department, and then it was for individual ministers then to determine how to prioritise that, including to use for pay awards. So it wouldn't be correct to say that there was a limit set on pay awards, but obviously there were assumptions that ministers had made in bringing that information forward.
Effectively, it sets limits on the overall funding available to the department. It is up to the departmental ministers how they manage that funding. Within that, the funding that was allocated was the full amount available to the executive, so we couldn't have went any further on that. And it will be for ministers to manage as best they can the pay awards within that.
If you want, I can go back to the point you raised there about budget cover transfers. So just to explain, budget cover transfers are normally used where there is a function that a Westminster or Whitehall department is holding money for, where it is delivering something, but here in Northern Ireland it is going to use a Northern Ireland department as a means by which to deliver that, or actually vice versa, because they can go both ways. And so in that situation, the Westminster department would transfer a proportion of its budget over to the relevant Northern Ireland department. So it really could be used for any function. It's anything really that is agreed between the donating department and the receiving department. So to short, there's no limit really, is what I was trying to get to there.
Okay, I mean, I'm keen to go through that again another time, but obviously time is a bit tight. I mean, some of the questions that stuck out to me, and you may not have the answer because it's hard to be over the detail of all that, as I'm sure you've probably tried. But like the 16.7 million projected DEL spend, DAERA, on rural affairs. I mean, if not through yourselves, I mean, more information on that I think would be useful, because rural affairs could mean anything. So just as a general point, also some other stuff. I mean, utility regulator, their net cash requirement is down, I think 163 million, and to me that seems to be astounding, given the fact that, you know, the energy crisis.
I can just to explain in terms of the utility regulator. The utility regulator actually receives a very, very tiny fraction of its funding from government. So the amount that's there is essentially just to cover some back office administration areas. The bulk of its expenditure is actually funded by the licence fees that it levies on the energy companies and utility companies that it regulates. So that change in the cash requirement is, to be honest, not really significant in the overall terms. I think it may have been just a change in terms of a creditor or a debtor from one year to the other in that year. Sorry, I'll just turn.
I appreciate you can't know these things off by heart, but it's my reading of it was a reduction of net cash requirement of 163 million, which seems to be excuse me, a lot. It's a change purely on that relatively small element of the funding that it receives directly from government, which is taxpayer funded, as opposed to funded from the energy companies and utility companies that it regulates.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't that there was a cut applied to their budget. The changes that was being reflected would have been changes put forward by the utility regulator themselves when comparing the rest.
I was going to say, just to put that in context there, because turning to the utility regulator's estimate, so the net resources that it receives from government comes to 316,000, whereas actually it receives 13.1 million in income from the utility companies. So you can see the 300,000 that it receives from government is only the tip of the iceberg there. You know, it's the vast majority of its work is funded through those licence fees.
Yeah, just two other quick points. The DFC department additional costs for legal cases. I don't think there was a figure was put on that, and I know obviously legal fees can increase, but it just seems to be strange that there's no even estimate, as I understand that. So yeah, just as a comment.
That's a question we can certainly take that too. To provide an answer to.
And then the other point, sorry, was I think going back to your point about the separated votes. In terms of the active travel grant, obviously there's a lot of concern about that. Money was reduced from that, if I recall correctly, to put into pothole and infrastructure, other aspects of infrastructure. Will there be a specific vote on that?
Well, that would be a decision for the infrastructure minister to make in terms of prioritising his overall budget allocation. So again, not having the detail of exactly how much was reallocated.
But generally speaking, that'll be part of the general vote on estimates rather than a specific standalone vote.
Any changes will be reflected in the SSE, because any changes that the infrastructure minister has made before the SSEs were produced will be reflected in that document, and they'll be in the relevant lines. But no, there won't be a specific vote on that.
Thanks, Ed.
Okay, Philip Brett.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that. I just wanted to check, so the point that Matthew had made earlier in relation to the spend under sole authority, so I'm new to finance, so I'm not 100% across it. So are these spends that there hasn't been legislation for, is that right?
Yes, frankly. So in the normal course of events, a department needs two things to be able to deliver a function. It needs to have a statutory power to deliver the function, and it also then needs to have the money, the approval to spend.
Okay.
There are some exceptions. Now, normally they're for relatively small areas of expenditure or things which will only be required for a relatively short period of time, in which case the Assembly would be asked to give the approval for both the delivery of the service and the spend on it within the Budget Act. And that's why these are highlighted to the Assembly in the estimates document. I mean, we put a black box symbol beside them, hence the black box.
Say short term?
Yes, so normally...
The first one on that, welfare reform and mitigation, has that not been quite a long run?
Well, that's as I was explaining earlier, in the normal course of events, these would be for short-term items of expenditure or relatively small areas of expenditure. But there are, because there hasn't been an Assembly sitting for the past 2 years and there hasn't been an executive in place, it hasn't been possible for standalone primary legislation to be brought to legislate for these things. So it has left us in a situation where there was no other statutory means to authorise this, and the risk would be then if it couldn't be done on sole authority of the Budget Act, that actually those services would have to stop. So this has been used, and said the Finance Minister explained this in the debate in the Budget Bill. Because of that exceptional circumstance, she had asked the Assembly to, on this occasion, approve the use of sole authority of the Budget Act for these things. Particularly, there was a welfare reform mitigation.
How long has that been in the? How long has it been operating for then, outside of legislative? I'm reluctant to speak from memory. I believe it began during the period when the Assembly wasn't sitting between 2017 and 2020. But I am speaking from memory here, so if I've got that wrong, I apologise. Okay, and then in terms of DFI and active travel, why would DFI not have legislative authority to spend money on that? And as Jerry rightly points out, they had an underspend in active travel. I have to put on a slightly different hat here, because I actually briefly worked in that area in the Department for Infrastructure, and I hope my former colleagues in Department for Infrastructure don't mind me saying this, but during the period between 2020 and 2022, the Department for Infrastructure was developing plans for specific legislation, because actually there isn't a specific legislation at the minute for that. We were looking at either an active travel bill or a blue-green bill at the time. However, then, because again with the collapse of the executive, that hadn't been able to progress any further. But again, this is something which I would assume, and again not to speak for Department for Infrastructure, I would assume this will be picked up again now that there's a minister in place and the Assembly's here to legislate. Dead on. And then Fiscal Council Minister committed to put it on the statutory footing, so that covers that.
Yep.
Truth Recovery Programme through TEO, is that outworkings of the proposed legacy?
It's mother and baby.
Okay, perfect. So then they'll have a strategy on ending violence against women and girls hopefully soon, so that covers that. Okay, so most of these then will be closed off.
Yeah, certainly those four big ones, which I said highlighted, the welfare reform, ending violence against women and girls, truth recovery, and homes for Ukraine, will be closed off with a combination of standalone legislation or two of them within the financial provisions bill, which the Department of Finance is planning to bring.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Just, Paul through.
Yes, thank you. So who actually fights then on behalf of the independent non-ministerial government departments, like the utility regulator?
The audit committee sets the budget for those independent departments.
I'm sorry, just to correct, sorry, the utility regulator, that's not the case. The three sort of truly independent ones, the Assembly Commission, the Audit Office and the Public Services Ombudsman are dealt with by the Assembly's Audit Committee. The other three have relationships with ministerial departments. So the Utility Regulator has a relationship with the Department for Economy. The Public Prosecution Service has a relationship with the Department for Justice. The Food Standards Agency has a relationship with the Department for Health. But they have a greater degree of independence than an arm's length body would have. Hence they've been established as a non-ministerial body.
So if the utility regulator, I believe, needs to be better funded in order to protect consumers from the worst excesses of the managed markets, including electricity, where do they go to when they need to plead poverty, or when they look to their plans of growth and expansion? Who do they go to with regards to their cry when it comes to needing more money?
Well, as I explained, they have a close relationship with the Department for Economy. So if that was the situation, I would be surprised if they weren't having that conversation with the Department for Economy with a view to, certainly if they needed legislation brought forward, for example, I would expect that it would be the Department for Economy and the Economy Minister who would bring something like that forward.
So they have a relationship, but they're independent at the same time. Is there a worry, and I know you sit beyond and above and beyond the Department of Finance, and you see a widespread aerial view, probably more so than the departments, but is there anything that has worried you with regards to that communication link or relationship between non-ministerial independent bodies and the budget process?
No, I don't think I would say there's been any worry there.
No, I mean, they can participate in the exercises, albeit they have the link with the departments. They have supply contacts in Barry and Patrick's team the same way as a department would have, so they can contact us in that way as well. And
the bid during, for example, during the budget process and during the in-year monitoring round process, they're invited to submit bids, and those bids will be assessed.
So is that a direct link or relationship between your office and them?
Yes. Sorry, I probably wasn't clear about that, but yes, absolutely. There's a supply, in the same way that we have supply teams with direct relationships with each of the ministerial departments. Those supply teams also have direct relationships with each of those non-ministerial bodies as well.
I suppose what Barry was referring to was if they needed a ministerial advocate, then they have that link in with the departments.
Yeah, that's okay. Fine.
Okay. Just a couple of further questions. And if anybody else wants back in, we won't detain you too long, but if anyone else wants back in, to indicate. Just on, you obviously, as you said, the biggest, in a sense, change since the main estimates, return of the Assembly, Executive and the financial package, which in some cases means, mostly thankfully means increased resource. Obviously it means the removal of the ring fence, which is most notably around shared and integrated education and that capital funding. I'm just looking here, where would I see that? I can't see it in the education line. Or is it
not in
it
this
be.
year, it's from 24-25 onwards. So the 708 million that was included in the financial package, that's where the
okay, sorry, that flexibility
but it doesn't kick in until 24-25.
Okay, the flexibility will be in the main, so that'll be in the main estimate. So you'll see a dramatic, basically see 150 million off capital.
No, because that would have been spread over a period of time, so it
Yeah.
wouldn't be 150 million in 24-25.
Right.
Education wouldn't have been
It'll be
planned to spend that in the 1 year.
profiled over a number of years.
It'll be profiled over a number of years.
Okay, that's fine. There are a few mentions, and including in the SSEs for education of the shared island income. In a sense, we don't get, because it's sort of that money comes in different announcements from the Irish government and then is allocated by Northern Ireland. It's never written. Have you guys got written down some of what the income from shared island is overall for, say, 23-24? It's just an interesting number to.
It's not something I would have immediately to hand, because it'll show any income to any department will show as a receipt, but it wouldn't necessarily be badged as a source of that receipt. Again, it's an answer we can provide for you. Okay?
I think it would be useful actually just to see, and I mean there are a number of obviously, you know, in addition to the block grant, you know, the other discrete areas of funding that come in, shared prosperity on top of the block. It would be interesting to see what the shared island numbers. And then I will bring Jerry Carroll back in. Owen Tennyson is going to come in a second. One other number is on FTC. We have been historically terrible at spending FTC. Is that picture getting any better as a result of what you're seeing? And
I would say we still have challenges in spending, and what I would say on the sort of to offset that, we have an arrangement by Treasury. You'll be aware that 80% of the FTC capital funding is repayable to the Treasury. Any of our underspends are counting against that repayment, which means that we don't have to repay money that we haven't spent, and that sort of helps to use that up, but we can always do better on the FTC. There's also uncertainty over how much FTC funding we will get going forward. It has been tailing off in terms of Barnett consequentials. Yeah. We won't know until the next spending review whether it will grow, stay steady, or actually drop off again.
It's inevitably a product of policy decisions made in England about how to spend. One final question is RRI. We are going to get increased RRI, but that won't be, and obviously was not in 23-24.
No, not in 23-24. From 24-25 onwards, the financial package increases it. So I think it goes from 200 up to 220 million per annum for next year.
To 20 million a year. So 20 million a year. Okay. Owen Tennyson.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's just to return briefly to the point about those non-ministerial government bodies. So just as an absolute point of clarity from my own understanding, so if you're talking about the utility regulator or the likes of the Public Prosecution Service, I understand, yes, any minister can advocate, but those bodies themselves would be responsible, for example, in terms of formulating the business case to go directly to the Department of Finance in relation to headcount or any of those issues. Other ministers wouldn't have a direct influence or say in those decisions.
I don't know that, as far as I know, they wouldn't filter their bids through the department. They have the relationship. So, for example, PPS will come to us directly with, I'm looking at Barry in case he corrects me.
You're
come directly to us
right.
with bids. The Justice Minister wouldn't either say they should bid for more or bid for less. What they do have is that sort of link because they're in similar areas where the Minister could advocate for them.
Sorry, the reason I hesitated there is it was the word influence, because they may, I'm sure the Justice Minister will meet with the Public Prosecution Service, and if you call that influence, but no, Joanne's absolutely right. Any bids or any submissions or any business cases aren't filtered through
direct.
Another department. Yes.
Okay, no, I understand that. Thank you. And just one final general question is just in terms of post the spring statement. What is the overall sort of block grant outlook for 24-25 and 25-26 at the moment?
Where you turn to me and I do not have the figure in front of me. I will confess, because we're talking about 23-24, I don't have the figure in front of me. We are up slightly on the resource del from where we would have been 23-24, excluding the financial package. So we are up, I think, a couple of 100 million on that. Then we have the 520 to add in from the financial package. Then there's the potential of 24.6 out of the 708 million because it's spread in equal tranches. So there is additional funding, plus there's the 99 million we got in the spring budget. So we are up slightly. What I would say is that despite having more funding, the pressures are greater, and I'm comparing it to a starting position, not the position at the end of the year with the financial package in there. So if you take at the end of the year, we got an additional over £1 billion from the financial package, but the financial package next year provides £520 million. It's a very challenging situation.
Thank you.
Can I just double check? I'll bring Jay in a second. One question, which is one of the points obviously we've all made and the Fiscal Council have made, is just this chaotic thing, which is linked. He makes a political statement to our chaotic kind of stop-start politics and stop-start evolution is different agreed pots of money for different things, and obviously part of the removal of the ring fence for certain things, or removal of what they're calling added flexibility, which is removing a ring fence that was agreed nearly a decade ago, or 8 or 9 years ago, in the Fresh Start agreement. But then we have Fresh Start, and we've got pots from Fresh Start. We've got a pot, which was then immediately much less than everybody thought, an NDNA, and I remember questioning you about that, Joanne. And then we have, are we now at a kind of zero base, year zero, there's no longer this kind of like, we still have this pot for that thing?
There's still a few tails from those. For example, all of the Fresh Start funding for shared education and housing was not removed, because there are some things that are contractually committed to that, and that will be funded. But they're certainly tailing off, and we're now coming to an end of those individual pots of money. Fresh Start was due to end, I think it was next year anyway. So there's a few residual bits, but most of it will be coming to an end now. And then the financial package, as you realise this time, apart from the ring fence for the transformation, is for the executive to decide how to spend.
Of course, I would say personally, I think the executive should put the ring fence back on shared and integrated education. I think it should do that, and I hope that happens in the budget.
And that is absolutely a matter for the executive. I suppose one point of clarity on that is the 708 million. There's only 463 of it is for the executive to decide. The remainder is ring fence for transformation. Plus the funding is now available in Resource Dale, whereas the Fresh Start would have been Capital Dale. So there's also decisions to be made there on whether you take some of that 700 and made it Resource Dale and transfer it into capital, or whether the executive decides to commit its Capital Dale funding and keep the resource given the pressures. There are a lot of decisions there that the executive
There's no obligation to make it resource, though. It's just you can do what you like with it. It could be resource or capital.
Well, the executive can move any resource money into Capital Dale. Unfortunately, it can't move money from capital to resource, but it has the flexibility to move resource to capital at any time.
Okay, Jerry Carroll, let's come back in.
Thanks. Just a bit more time, but just clarity, Joanne, and based what you said, and the Minister, I understand what she said last week on the pay awards. I mean, my recollection from the Minister in terms of the transport pay offer was that she indicated, if not outrightly said it, that the DFI Minister didn't request more than the 5%. So I'm trying to work out sort of process and policy and what works how, what way. Like, did the executive agree at 5% across the board, and then their estimates, their bids is based on that? Because it's really the process of how that works out is unclear to me, being obviously a non-executive party. So I'm trying to work out, because I think you said that it's up to the ministers to decide how they spend their money, but also there's obviously executive policy to say whether to uplift or to apply for more money, or to have contingency funding for rejection of pay offer. So I'm just kind of trying to work out how that works out in practice.
Well, it is absolutely up to individual ministers, and they were given pots of money, but the money that was available to the executive was absolutely limited to what was in the financial package. And actually the executive finance minister sought flexibility from the Treasury, and there was more money, 100 million more money went into pay than had been provided for previously in the financial package. As far as I'm aware, there was no decisions on percentage increases. It was simply based on forecast expenditures throughout the year, the pot of money that was available in the financial package, with a bit of additional flexibility to give 100 million more to that. What I would say is that the executive allocated the full amount of money available. It could not set aside contingency funding in 23-24, because that funding would then have been lost. We have no carry forward in 23-24 into 24-25 in Resource Dale. If the money is not spent in 23-24, it goes back to the Treasury. So we couldn't set aside contingency funding for that. So it was important for the executive to allocate all of the money that it could, and it did that in the best way possible across the board, with pressures in all departments.
Final, Chair. Just so the likes of there's a big sort of issue with the pay and grading review of EA workers, classroom assistants, and education workers more generally. If that's going to be processed, is that a new application from the Education Minister? Is that part of future budgets? In terms of how that works out, because it's a question that's was asked me this morning, but also it's quite live, you know.
A business case for that was submitted to us, but there were errors and some financial information that was missing from that. Now, my team have been working closely with DE since then to nail down the cost. I think it is likely that that will be a 24-25 issue, given the point in time we are now. But that is certainly something that will be considered in for 24-25. But
Appreciate the answer, but obviously a lot of the workers will appreciate this. You've been on a long time, and probably a year will be. It may not come, but
another couple of weeks. You know, we're a couple of weeks away from the start of the financial year, and it's important that when we're spending public money, due process is followed. And I know people get very frustrated with the business case process, but it's important.
I would stress the distinction between the point in time at which those costs accrue in the department's accounts and therefore hit their budgets, because as Joanne said, it's the 20th of March now. I don't think there's anything that could be physically done to have, even if a pay award was to be agreed this minute, to have something put through in salaries by the end of March. But
but the point is that just it's been going on for a long time.
And it's unfortunate people have to.
Obviously a few weeks' time, but obviously it could be March next year with a no. Okay, thanks. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I feel Brett wants to come back in. Yeah.
So just on Jerry's point, so a revised business case is now with?
It's with ourselves. I appreciate this does sound frustrating. It is still not clear that the costs in that are absolutely correct. My team, I was actually speaking to one of the team this morning just to get an update on that. So I think we're very close to it, but there are still some points to.
Yeah, just to be fair to
just advise the committee if the Education Authority have submitted another business case with incorrect information.
Yeah, no.
Like we were at a situation a month ago where the EA didn't know how many people it employed or how many people had been waiting for a regrading and for much deserved public sector award. So I think the people who have been contacting me and contact now, I assume all members of this committee, if they were to know that their employer 4 weeks later still didn't know how many people they employed, that would be a pretty shocking situation.
I think, to be fair to the Department for Education as well, before Barry will come in the detail, business cases do tend to be an iterative process. It would be quite normal for a business case to come in and for us to ask questions and there to be a back and forward just to make sure that there's a good understanding of that.
I just, because I know you were focusing very much on the Education Authority and everybody has understandably been, I just want to make the point, not all of the staff involved in this are employed by the Education Authority. There are other staff groups that are also affected, and it's actually just hammering down exactly which other staff groups this affect as well. But that has actually been part of the issue.
So I assume the overwhelming majority are...
The overwhelming majority of the...
I just wanted to check then in relation to, so funding obviously was then awarded to each department for public sector pay awards. So the Department for the Economy got 27 million, I think, if I can remember. So FE lecturers have rejected their offer. So as Jerry said, then DFI have there's been rejection of that offer. So money that is then in this year's budget for those pay awards that obviously will not be awarded this month and maybe enough. What happens with that? Is that able then just to transfer?
No, it doesn't transfer across. What may likely happen is that what has been offered may well be accrued to this year, which means that actually, even though the cash doesn't necessarily follow in this year, that amount,
it recognises the liability. Yeah. If an offer has been rejected, the department will say this will be the minimum that will be handed, therefore we can put it in our accounts because it's a liability we'll absolutely have.
That's useful. Thank you.
Okay, one final question from me. It's not entirely clear because we didn't have conventional budget statements. There was a formal budget statement last year from the NIO, and then there was a draft multi-year budget the year before that the finance minister didn't get agreed. but are we still paying a block grant reduction every year for long-haul air passenger duty?
Yes, that was the terms of the devolution of the air passenger duty. I don't have the exact figure, it's a small amount, but yes.
I'm not asking you to defend or sell the policy, but it's about £2.5 million a year for long-haul flights. Okay, I'm just going to go on Skyscanner here and book my flight from Belfast to somewhere in the long haul, because of course there are loads that we are paying for £2.5 million. Anyway, okay, that's me being facetious, but thank you very much, Joanne and Barry. Unless there are any questions, I'm sure we'll hear from you in the near future. Thank you again, and hope you get it's been a busy few months for you. So, in advance of all the other budget-related stuff, we hope you get a break over Easter.
Thanks.
Wouldn't that
I suspect not.
Well, a break of some kind. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Chair, we have a number of items we're going to pick up from that, which will be the beauty of having Hansard here. We'd be able to lift all of those additional questions.
So I need to go back and summarise them now. The various bits of information that were requested, they will be requested, and I won't go through them all now because I don't remember them all. I didn't take notes of all of them.
I have notes, but Hansard.
They'll be in Hansard. Okay. That was really useful. Agenda item 11 is correspondence. Members, this week's correspondence starts at page 426 of your pack. There are 4 items of correspondence to draw your attention to, and you will have an opportunity to comment on all of them. The first item 11.1 is correspondence from the Minister of Finance to the Minister of Finance from the Health Department. So the Health Committee has written to the Minister of Finance regarding the junior doctors' pay dispute. So that is to note, unless any members wish to make any specific comments about that. Jerry Carroll.
Just a general point. I appreciate it being included in the pack, but I mean, being told there's no extra funding for junior doctors. Last year, the department spent £400 million on agency staff, so this idea that money isn't available or money's tied up is something that certainly I and my party don't buy, but I was in the pick of line with those workers, and will continue to do so if they declare any other dates.
Yes, I mean, I would, okay. That's helpful. Unless there's any other comments, I mean, it's really just to note. Obviously, we'll be copied in. It'll be helpful. We'll get a response, so people will be able to see the card. This is correspondence from the committee to the minister.
Can I just ask a question through you, Chair, to the clerk? Is it usual practice for statutory committees to write to ministers other than the minister that they are scrutinising?
No, but there's no proof. There's no proof against it, and I don't think we should. And I genuinely don't think we should be perturbed by us doing it.
No, I'm not suggesting we should. It just I hadn't come across it before, and I was wondering what the protocol was.
The protocol is you copy in the relevant scrutiny committee. So, say for example, this committee was writing to the health minister, we would copy in the health committee. Therefore, the members of that committee or this committee are aware if there's correspondence going to their relevant minister. It's a practical.
It's definitely, obviously, it's less common than the committee writing to the department they specifically scrutinise, but it certainly, in my relatively limited experience, does happen. Okay, members are agreed to note. Then the next item is memorandum of reply to the Public Accounts Committee report into the review of the Northern Ireland budget process. Members, at page 427 of the pack, the department has published its memorandum of reply to the Public Accounts Committee on their review of the budget process. Members, of the 10 recommendations made in the PAC report, 2 are noted, 3 are accepted, 4 are accepted in principle, and 1 is partially accepted. I think, and I might ask the clerk if he has a view on this, if 2 are noted, are the 2 noted because they don't need to be accepted, or are they noted because it's a passive-aggressive way of saying they don't accept them?
Chair, I could possibly comment on that. The noted will mean there, and I need to go into specifics of this, but it generally will mean that there's further work to be done, that they aren't necessarily possible, that work has already been completed.
Yeah.
So we need to go into specifics about that.
So, personally, for example, I'll just make one comment and then I'll open it up to I was involved in a little bit of this in the previous. I sat in the PAC for a while in the previous mandate. one of the recommendations that DOF notes rather than accepts is a specific recommendation for a kind of is that there should be together. Committee recommends that together with the head of the Civil Service and the Executive Office, the Department considers what changes or powers are necessary to ensure a stronger centre of government in Northern Ireland. Speaking personally, I think that's a very wise recommendation, because we have, believe it or not, a relatively weak centre of government. Despite lots of things flowing through the Executive Office, there are at times quite limited powers for the centre of government to be able to make strategic decisions. I don't think that's an unreasonable one, but that's just my view personally. But the Vice Chair want to come in?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. I just declare I sit also on the Public Accounts Committee here, but I just wanted to highlight two of the recommendations, how I feel that they're relevant here. Recommendation number 1, where it's advising the education programme for budget to be widely rolled out. Like we've touched on this already here, and I just wanted to flag it again that throughout the committees for the different departments, the perception that the Finance Committee is going to pick up and scrutinise the budget for everyone still is very much out there. So if these particular recommendations, if there's any way we could highlight and emphasise these throughout all of the committees as well, to make sure that that education programme hits all of our committees.
Yep.
And the other one was under recommendation 8. Now, the Department of Finance accept the recommendation here, but I just wanted to take it a step further. It's on the Department of Finance taking the lead on their correspondence on keeping pressure on HM Treasury. And in regard to it, the Department of Finance talks about continuing to liaise with regard to levelling up and share prosperity fund. I would ask that the committee would consider writing to the Minister or asking the Minister or officials here if there could be an update given on Shared Prosperity Levelling Up Fund here to us, because it is referenced within that, but it's within the round of dealing with Treasury and our financial package and how we're funded. But I just wanted to draw those particular things out. Just think it's something that we could maybe put on the agenda here for an update.
I certainly think so. A letter worth sending, yeah. I think particularly given it's part of the financial package.
We include the community ownership fund in
yes, yeah.
update.
Yeah, I think that's wise. Just on the memorandum, unless there are any further comments in detail on the memorandum itself, there are a number of recommendations. It is very detailed. I think it's worthy of us having a longer conversation than we're able to have now. So I would suggest that we note it at the minute, but then take it forward to the strategic planning day we have planned in about a month's time on the 24th of April, and we can discuss potential follow-up then if people are content with that. Item 11.3 is quarterly sickness absence in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. These are statistics that have been sent to us by NISRA. So, I mean, the only comment I have to make, because I haven't had a chance to go through them in detail yet, is that they could probably be broken down for us in a slightly more relatively digestible way, because they're not particularly easy to scan in the way that they're sent to us.
We did have to ask, especially for them in the format they're in, because they were going to switch to a whole Excel spreadsheet thing, so this was an ask to get it as this. If there are further refinements members would like, again, that's something we can talk about more about. We will engage directly on that. I have to say, to be fair to NISRA, they've been very accommodating in terms of retaining the format that we were used to and that we requested. And we can move on that one. Chair, Mr.
Yes,
so this is something when I was last on the Finance Committee that we did have a wee look at, and we did check on these every so often. But what I would like to see, because they have a table 1, which is the key facts, which is basically October 22 to December 23. So it's basically just more than a year. They basically took a snapshot, table displays, trends, information for some of the measures of sickness absence in the civil service in the last 5 quarters. What I would like to know and what I'd like to compare is a period of time pre-pandemic, just to see if there is any differentials either coming out of lockdown philosophy or working from home. You could imagine that if you were sick, you could probably throw working at home better than going into an office, and there'll be safety issues there too, I suppose, if you're sick and going into a full office. So it's just to see if there's any differential between post-pandemic and pre-pandemic, basically. So if we could have a similar time period,
a longer time series, I think that's not an unreasonable question. I'm not sure that we'd use the phrase, if it's okay with you, proper lockdown philosophy, but if we can certainly ask for a longer time series on.
That'll all be there, so it's just a matter of putting it together.
If they clear the data, it'll be there. Okay.
Chair, sorry.
Yes.
And just to note, I've got the current figures open in front of me. You have to have the 5 quarters set out like that. You can see the October last year to compared to this October figure. It would be nice to see them all period by period, side by side, so it actually is quite meaningful. But when you look at October 23 and to December 23, there's quite a significant spike to the same period in the previous Christmas. And just, I was looking at last year's accounts, and in 22-23, the cost of sick leave to the civil service was 39 million. Well, over the past 4 quarters, that's looking at 42.4 million for this current in-year period. So coming up this year, we're going to see obviously a very clear increase in that. So it's going to be a figure that's going to come under scrutiny again. So it's just important that we get the best information on that, just to support Paul's point.
Yeah.
Okay. If members are content with those actions, we will move on. The next item is correspondence from an individual regarding the Northern Ireland University sector. At page 449, there's correspondence from this individual regarding the university sector. If members are content to seek to note that correspondence at this point. Item 11.5 is correspondence from the Finance Minister regarding amending the law on marriage and civil partnership. Members on page 322 of the tabled pack, the Minister has written to indicate that she is minded to legislate to amend the law on marriage and civil partnership to increase the minimum age to 18. This change was made from 16, I think, is just for clarity. The change was made in the south of Ireland in 2019 and in England and Wales last year. Minister advises that this is in line with a consultation undertaken by her predecessor, Conor Murphy, MLA. The Minister will write to executive colleagues to initiate the process to make the relevant legislative amendments, and the Minister has offered briefing from officials. If members are content to note the letter and to seek a briefing from officials.
Great, noted.
Right. Okay, then agenda item 12 is draft forward work. Members to note is the draft forward work programme, which is at page 457. We touched on the strategy day towards the end of April, and you'll see the updated briefing. The next proposed meeting is obviously on the 10th of April in room 21, when we will have an oral briefing on Nix HR and transformation, and also on Department of Finance, including, I think, budget pressures for the department itself. This is the department's budget pressure, so we do the kind of particular focus on the department's own in-house budget, as it were, and then they can see the rest of the forward work programme for there, if people are content. And obviously it's a moving feast. Yes.
I just wanted to check, Chair. See the strategic planning session, I assume, does that just take place at the normal time of committee?
Yeah, that'll be a normal committee time, and in this building. We're not offering an
No, that's okay. It's just because it said time to be confirmed, and I'm just conscious of other commitments.
It'll be normal committee time.
Well, okay. If people are happy enough, then now we'll have to get members' agreement for that to be published on the committee webpage.
Great.
I would also suggest that obviously we will need to revisit this in discussion on the 10th of April, because we will then have possibly slightly more detail on when we're going to see the budget, and we may want to, and we may have developments that we want to seek other oral evidence or do other work on. But if people are content, we'll publish that on the committee website. Agenda item 13 is any other business. I have one item of other business, which is simply to suggest that we write to the department to ask that the Minister keeps us abreast of developments around the 24-25 annual budget. We just got that update from Joanne McBurney saying that she expects that the Minister will bring that to the executive after Easter. I think it's reasonable, given we're off now we're away for a fortnight from the start of next week, but for 2.5 weeks, that we are kept abreast of developments and get any and get a written update as to timings. I think that's particularly important because, you know, I don't think it would be, I think if the longer we get a heads up, then the more time we have to prepare and plan. I think if we came straight back in and got a budget statement, not saying that would happen, it limits our ability to scrutinise, and given we've had to come headlong back in and have a budget bill, now 2 votes on account and various things, I think it's important that we have as much heads up as possible to when a budget statement's coming. People are content?
Great.
Okay, any other business? In that case, date, time and place of next meeting is, as we've discussed, 10th of April, 2 p.m, room 21 this time of Parliament Buildings. We're not doing an education session before that?
No, not before, no. We need to plan in the rest of the training series from Reyes, and then we've got further training sessions from the department where we plug those in, probably beyond April.
Okay.
Yeah, trying to leave a bit of flexibility in case we have extra budget.
Okay, in that case, the committee does now adjourn. Thank you very much.
Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Senate Chamber, programme signed.